The annual harvest flower display at Flaxborough's St. Swithin's Church was intended, as ever, to combine a modest exhibition of chrysanthemums with a greater show of civic unity. The vicar, Reverend Toombs, presided with a smile that seemed to have been stitched permanently to his face by some parishioner skilled in embroidery. Ladies in cardigans of disciplined beige fluttered around arrangements of Michaelmas daisies, and gentlemen of the council committee nodded sagely, as if an unusually large marrow might influence the borough rates. It was at the side table, beneath a rather tragic pyramid of apples that had seen too many nights in someone's shed, that the disruption occurred. Young Colin Drabble, 11 years old, soprano chorister, much remarked upon by the older ladies for his sweet, clear voice, was carrying a brown envelope of some importance. He had been entrusted with it by his aunt, who sold stamps in the high street and believed that all postal errands were more secure when placed in the hands of blood relations. Colin was less certain of the solemnity of his mission. He regarded the envelope more as a ballast, something to fiddle with while looking at the dahlias. Still he remembered his aunt's words, straight into the box, mind and don't dawdle. He would, he thought, obey, just as soon as he had finished examining a brass bowl of nasturtiums that reminded him of fireworks. Several eyes, however, had noticed the envelope which bore, in its upper corner, a glossy adhesive label far too decorative to suggest a bill. Mrs. Cam, the verger's wife, saw Colin tuck it under his hymn book and whispered to her neighbour that the boy was probably carrying love letters. The neighbour, Mrs. Fothergill, enlarged the suspicion immediately. The child must have stumbled upon blackmail material, for why else the secrecy? By the time the whisper reached the jam stall, it had become a matter of a parcel of foreign stamps, highly improper, which Colin was conveying to the post. What Colin himself knew, or thought he knew, was less scandalous and, in its way, more peculiar. The envelope contained a subscription renewal, neatly filled in, and with a postal order enclosed. His aunt had been most particular that the form be posted today, but the subscription was not hers. She had said it was for a friend who doesn't like to be seen buying things at the newsagent. Colin, who had once been sent to purchase true romances for her, did not question the delicacy of adult taste. The matter might have rested in obscurity were it not for two coinciding events. First, Colin, overcome by a sudden craving for a toffee apple, laid the envelope down on the window-sill and forgot it entirely. Second, a mild breeze, encouraged by a side door being propped open for the arrival of more chrysanthemums, whisked the envelope onto the floor, where it skidded against the ankle of Alderman Blunt. Blunt, never one to let pass any object that might serve as a lever in local intrigue, picked it up. His gaze at once registered the printed masthead, the Rapture Weekly, illustrated tales of passion and sin. The title stood, in bold purple type, far from ecclesiastical. By tea-time, the town was alive with the discovery. Flaxborough possessed the kind of collective nervous system that transmitted any tremor of gossip instantly to its extremities. The verger's wife declared to the drapery assistant that the choir was now corrupt. The drapery assistant told the postmistress that indecency was involved. The postmistress told her husband that police action would be necessary. Inspector Purbright first heard of it from Sergeant Malley, who entered the station duty room with the solemnity of one reporting a burglary. "There's been an incident at the flower show, sir." Purbright, who had just settled with the afternoon paper and a cup of tea, raised his eyebrows. "A collision of gladioli, Malley?" "Worse, sir, a boy with a well, with a dirty magazine subscription. Alderman Blunt brought it in." Purbright accepted the brown envelope, which Blunt had, of course, delivered in person, complete with his own annotations in pencil. The inspector regarded the label with quiet amusement. The choirboy's name and address were neatly entered on the form, though whether he was the subscriber or merely the courier was not yet known. "Well," Purbright said at last, laying the envelope down as if it were something delicate but not dangerous, "we had better ascertain who precisely is nourishing an appetite for the Rapture Weekly. It will be instructive, I suspect, though not in the way Alderman Blunt hopes." And with that, the quiet machinery of Flaxborough's peculiar brand of scandal began to turn. By the following morning, the matter of Colin Drabble's envelope had undergone the usual process of multiplication by which Flaxborough scandals were created. The town's inhabitants, being industrious in very little besides embroidery of fact, had already determined that the choirboy was either the victim of seduction by a travelling bookseller, the accomplice of a smuggling ring that operated through hymnals, or perhaps, worst of all, the willing agent of moral decay at the very heart of St. Swithin's. Each repetition of the tale was seasoned according to the teller's prejudices, and by the time Mrs. Plumbley informed her hairdresser, it had become established that the boy had been receiving parcels of lurid photographs from abroad, possibly France. Purbright, meanwhile, had no intention of devoting serious police time to the misdelivery of a subscription form. Still, Flaxborough was not a place where matters of reputation could be disregarded. Already a deputation of church ladies had called at the station, demanding reassurance that the youth choir remained fit to sing at Harvest Evensong. Purbright received them with polite gravity, making notes as though he were recording testimony in a major fraud case, and gently promised that all due diligence would be applied. The ladies departed with sighs of mingled relief and disappointment, the former at the inspector's courtesy, the latter at his lack of dramatic pronouncements. Sergeant Malley, less adept at disguising his amusement, ventured later. "Seems to me, sir, if half the stories are true, young Colin is on the verge of running an international vice racket." Purbright merely murmured that exaggeration was Flaxborough's second most reliable crop after Marrow's. At Colin's home, meanwhile, reality was both plainer and, to Colin's mind, less comfortable. His aunt, Miss Drabble, was a lean, sharp-eyed woman who lived above her stamp shop with the air of one who had learned economy in her cradle. She confronted her nephew with the envelope's recovery as if he had attempted high treason. "You were told to post it," she hissed, while Colin, red-faced and apologetic, stammered about apples and breezes. "Do you know what comes of negligence, boy?" "Scandal, that's what." Her gaze darted towards the front window, as if she expected scandal itself to come creeping through the glass. To her mortification, the scandal did not delay. Mrs. Cam appeared at the shop door, ostensibly to purchase 2 envelopes, but with every intention of extracting details. Such a pity, she sighed, once she had secured her stationery, that a child should be burdened with such literature. "I dare say it unsettles their voices." Miss Drabble bristled and retorted that her nephew was innocent of anything more than an errand, which prompted Mrs. Cam to murmur, "Ah, but errands are the channels through which evil flows." With that she departed, leaving the shop heavy with the odour of insinuation. It was against this atmosphere of half-suppressed indignation that Purbright paid his first call. He arrived at the stamp shop late in the afternoon, bowler hat in hand, and presented himself with the apologetic smile of a man seeking to borrow a teaspoon. Miss Drabble, though affronted by the necessity, ushered him in with stiff politeness. "I must apologize," Purbright began, "for troubling you in what is hardly a police matter." Still, Alderman Blunt was insistent that impropriety had occurred. "Perhaps you could clarify." Miss Drabble stiffened further, which was remarkable in itself. "The subscription is not mine, Inspector. It is on behalf of a friend." She delivered the word friend with such emphasis that it invited more suspicion than it erased. Purbright inclined his head gently. "And this friend?" "They prefer not to be identified. The town, as you may have observed, is not generous in its opinions." Purbright allowed the silence to expand. as though he were considering the truth of this claim. Then, with apparent mildness, he asked, "Would this friend perhaps be a gentleman?" The faintest flicker in Miss Drabble's eyes betrayed something she had not meant to reveal. She recovered quickly, insisting the matter was private and above reproach, and that Colin's involvement had been accidental. Purbright accepted the answer without challenge, only noting that the woman's indignation was slightly too rehearsed. By evening, the gossip cycle reached the railway arms, where the town's tradesmen and minor officials discussed events with a seriousness they never bestowed upon accounts or ledgers. Alderman Blunt held forth with relish, insisting that the subscription indicated corruption at the very heart of our moral institutions. Mr. Hargreaves, the draper, muttered that it was more likely a case of misplaced curiosity, while the landlord confided that in his youth he had once perused a sensational weekly and found it tame compared with half the notices in the Gazette. Their laughter did little to cool Blunt's indignation, which he clearly intended to parade at the next council meeting. Purbright, seated in a quiet corner, listened with the air of a man collecting butterflies. He noted each name, each allusion, each denial that suggested greater knowledge than was claimed. He sipped his ale slowly, his expression betraying no more than polite interest. To the untrained ear, the talk was a jumble of exaggerations. To Purbright, it was the opening bars of a familiar tune, the overture of scandal that hinted at more substantial discord beneath. As he walked back to the station through the dimly lit streets, he reflected on the curious attachment that provincial respectability had to secret amusements. People who would not so much as jaywalk in daylight might contrive, with elaborate secrecy, to indulge in the most innocent of escapades, provided they were slightly shameful. The rapture. Weekly, he thought, might well be a symptom rather than a crime. The question was, whose symptom? Inspector Purbright began his enquiries the following morning with the same quiet patience he reserved for situations in which the offence was less criminal than sociological. He suspected from long experience that what truly required unravelling was not the matter of a lurid periodical, but the deeper question of who in Flaxborough was sufficiently concerned with appearances to hide their reading habits behind the guise of a choir boy's errand. His first call was again to young Colin Drabble, this time at the grammar school, where the boy was still recovering from the twin blows of his aunt's reproaches and the sidelong glances of classmates who had heard, through their parents, that Colin was a purveyor of wicked literature. Purbright requested a word with him in the headmaster's study, a chamber lined with books that had been purchased for appearance rather than utility. Colin, perched on the edge of the chair, clutched his cap as though it were a lifebelt. Purbright, in tones as mild as if he were asking the boy about his favourite cricket batsman, inquired how he came to carry the envelope. "My aunt gave it to me," Colin confessed miserably. "Said it was for a friend who didn't want to be seen at the newsagent. She told me to post it, and I meant to, sir. But then the apples—" "Yes," Purbright said with quiet amusement. "The apples are already a matter of record." He asked if Colin knew the identity of this friend. Colin shook his head vigorously. "She never told me, sir. Only that it was private." He looked up anxiously as if fearing he might be expelled from the choir. "It's not wicked, is it? Only a story paper." Purbright reassured him, with a gentle smile, that the moral health of the choir was not in jeopardy. He sent the boy back to class, leaving the headmaster satisfied that discipline had been maintained, though faintly disappointed that no expulsion was forthcoming. Next, Purbright returned to the town itself, where conversations about the subscription were flourishing in every shop and parlour. At the post office, Mrs. Mounts, the postmistress, spoke with relish about foreign publications and hinted that the subscription might be tied to continental influences undermining British youth. At the bakery, the proprietor suggested that Alderman Blunt himself was fond of sensational journals and might be projecting his tastes onto others. Purbright listened politely, making notes with the appearance of seriousness, though each remark was filed in his mind as an indicator of personal bias rather than evidence. By late afternoon, he called upon Alderman Blunt, who had been waiting, almost vibrating with anticipation, to give his version of the event. Blunt was a stout man, always dressed as if for an official photograph, and he greeted the inspector with the air of a prosecutor welcoming a jury. He launched immediately into a speech about the moral pollution of youth and the necessity for decisive police action. "If we permit this sort of filth," Blunt thundered, "next we shall have the choir boys smoking foreign cigarettes in the vestry." Purbright, unruffled, asked a few polite questions about where precisely the envelope had been found and whether Blunt had noted any other details. The alderman could provide little more than what was already known, but his insistence on police intervention was so forceful that Purbright quietly wondered if Blunt had some interest in distracting the town's attention from another matter entirely. The man's zeal had the faint whiff of self-protection. As dusk settled, Purbright took a walk through the churchyard. He liked, in the early stages of inquiry, to let the quiet of stones and grass sift the chatter of the town into its proper proportions. The image of Miss Drabble, rigid and defensive, returned to him. Her insistence that the subscription was not hers had carried a little too much force, as though she feared precisely that conclusion. More curious still was her remark about the town's lack of generosity in its opinions. That suggested the subscriber was someone of local prominence, perhaps someone for whom discovery would be a genuine embarrassment. The inspector made one last call before the day ended, stopping at the railway arms. There he sought out the landlord, Mr. Packwood, whose ears collected gossip as naturally as pewter mugs collected froth. Over a glass of beer, Purbright asked, in a tone of idle speculation, whether any of the town's gentlemen had been observed purchasing unusual reading material. Packwood, lowering his voice as though confiding state secrets, mentioned that Councillor Hargreaves had once been seen slipping a copy of Modern Miss into his newspaper. But then again, the landlord added with a shrug, half the town reads something they wouldn't like their neighbours to see. Purbright left the inn with no dramatic revelations, but with the quiet satisfaction that the field of interest was beginning to take shape. The subscription was unlikely to be random. It had travelled through the hands of Miss Drabble, a woman who clung fiercely to respectability on behalf of a friend, whose identity she guarded too sharply. Alderman Blunt had seized on the discovery with too much eagerness, perhaps to divert gossip elsewhere, and scattered among the townsfolk were hints of personal weakness, embarrassment, or petty secrets, all of them perfectly ordinary, all of them fertile ground for scandal. As Purbright walked home beneath the gas lamps, he reflected that in Flaxborough the truth rarely lay in what people did, but in how fervently they sought to conceal what they did not wish others to believe of them. The brown envelope was less a clue in itself than a mirror, showing each inhabitant what they most feared to reveal. His task would be to discover whose reflection was the truest. The following morning's Gazette carried a small but perfectly positioned piece beneath the headline, "Unusual Matter at Church Flower Display." The article, couched in tones of solemn neutrality, reported that a publication of an unsuitable nature had been discovered in the possession of a choir boy. It mentioned no names, but was sufficiently clear in its allusions for the entire town to understand exactly who had been carrying the envelope and where. The Gazette had long perfected this art, publishing details precise enough to wound, yet vague enough to avoid litigation. By mid-morning, speculation was not merely circulating, but coagulating into what Flaxborough citizens always longed for: certainty. The certainty in this case was that Miss Drabble herself must have been the subscriber. The logic was irresistible to the town mind. She owned the shop, she had access to stamps and postal orders, she was known to have sharp tastes, and she had a nephew readily available to act as her courier. To those who wished for more colour, it was pointed out that she lived alone, and women who lived alone invariably required some form of diversion. Inspector Purbright was neither surprised nor convinced. He listened politely when Sergeant Malley presented this theory with the confidence of one who had solved the matter. Neatly, all fit, sir. She's embarrassed, so she hides it behind the boy. Explained her temper yesterday. Purbright, who had spent enough years in Flaxborough to distrust neatness, observed that embarrassment was an equal opportunity affliction and could as easily indicate knowledge of another person's secret. But Malley, eager to conclude, suggested arrest or at least a formal caution. Purbright gently reminded him that no crime had been committed unless one stretched obscenity laws to an extent that the magistrates, several of whom were Gazette readers themselves, would find uncomfortable. Nevertheless, the case against Miss Drabble grew throughout the day. At the post office, customers noted her pinched expression and took it as confirmation. At the butcher's, she was observed purchasing liver with unusual briskness, clearly a sign of inner agitation. By evening, the Railway Arms was unanimous. Miss Drabble had been caught in the act of subscribing to indecency. Purbright decided to call on her once more, if only to test the resilience of the town's favoured conclusion. He found her in her small parlour, rigid at her sewing table. She greeted him coolly, as though aware that she was already on trial in every drawing-room. "I assure you, Inspector," she said before he could sit down, "that I have no interest whatsoever in such papers. My life is entirely occupied by the shop and my nephew." Purbright inclined his head, his gaze resting on the neatly stacked ledgers at her side. "I do not doubt your industriousness, Miss Drabble. Still, one cannot help but notice that you were at pains yesterday to emphasize the subscription's privacy. Might I ask again whose it was?" She tightened her lips. "I will not betray my confidence." "Even if that confidence brings you under suspicion?" Her eyes flashed. "If one must suffer slander to protect a friend, then so be it." Purbright allowed the silence to hang until the tick of the mantel clock became audible. "It is admirable, Miss Drabble. But you must appreciate that the longer the secret persists, the more elaborations the town will produce. Sometimes the kindest course to a friend is clarity." She did not answer, and he did not press. Instead, he stood and thanked her for her time, leaving her with an expression that suggested sympathy rather than judgment. Back at the station, Malley was ready with further reports. Several townsfolk had come forward to declare that they had long suspected Miss Drabble of improper reading habits. One gentleman claimed to have seen her leafing through a sensational magazine at the railway bookstall 2 summers ago. Another recalled a remark she once made about French postcards. It was all, to Purbright's mind, the usual accumulation of retrospective certainties applied like plaster over the faintest cracks of possibility. Still, the chorus of suspicion achieved its aim. By the week's end, it was tacitly accepted throughout Flaxborough that Miss Drabble was guilty of little short of moral degeneracy. Parents muttered about withdrawing Colin from the choir. The vicar spoke of prayerful vigilance. Even the Gazette prepared a follow-up piece about the sad decline of standards among certain tradeswomen. Purbright, however, withheld judgment. He had learned that when a town achieved unanimity, it was usually mistaken. The collective appetite for scandal tended to seize upon the most obvious target, preferably someone unmarried, reticent, or otherwise ill-equipped to defend themselves. Such scapegoats provided a moral spectacle, but seldom the truth. On Saturday evening, he strolled past the stamp shop and saw Miss Drabble drawing her curtains against the glow of gas lamps outside. Her silhouette, tall and stiff, lingered for a moment before the fabric fell. Purbright paused, reflecting that guilt often bent the figure inward, whereas she remained almost defiantly upright. He resumed his walk, considering how best to continue. Miss Drabble was convenient, but convenience rarely solved anything. Somewhere, beyond the chatter and assumptions, lay a trivial but telling detail he had not yet uncovered. And until that revealed itself, he would permit the town to enjoy its certainty, knowing it would not last. On Sunday morning, the town, as if unwilling to let the matter of Miss Drabble's supposed depravity rest even for the Sabbath, began embellishing its story with further colour. Some said she ordered entire crates of immoral books, others that Colin was her partner in distributing them among schoolmates. Gossip, having established its principal villain, was now free to embroider until the narrative resembled melodrama. Purbright, however, found himself less and less convinced. The woman's protestations, though rigid, had the quality of someone protecting not herself, but another. He spent part of the day reviewing the envelope itself, which remained in police possession. It was an ordinary brown packet, properly stamped, properly addressed, to the magazine's London office. Yet as he turned it in his hands, something small caught his eye. On the gummed flap at the back was a faint smudge of pink lipstick, perhaps, or some decorative paint. It seemed trivial enough, but Purbright's interest sharpened. Miss Drabble was not, he felt certain, the type to waste cosmetics on sealing an envelope. The mark suggested a different hand, one that lingered over trivial flourishes. He tucked the observation away, choosing not to mention it yet to Sergeant Malley, who would only seize upon it as proof that women of Miss Drabble's age could not be trusted. Instead, Purbright decided to revisit the circle of those most animated by the scandal to see whether this odd, overlooked detail might connect with something in their behaviour. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Tombs, received him in the rectory drawing-room with an air of theatrical delicacy, as though she were about to faint from the strain of moral vigilance. She spoke at length about the importance of maintaining the choir's innocence and lamented that temptation had penetrated even their sacred walls. Purbright asked, almost idly, whether she had seen the envelope. She admitted she had, for Alderman Blunt had waved it under her nose. Most distasteful, Inspector. I should think any woman would blush to be connected with it. As she said this, she lifted a teacup that bore a faint, pink impression of her lips, matching, Purbright noted, the shade upon the envelope. It was only a fleeting impression, and he was not one to leap upon coincidence. Still, the trivial detail began to gather weight. Mrs. Tombs was not a woman free of vanities. She dressed with care, and her taste for strong lipstick shades was locally remarked upon. Could it be a mere chance that an identical smudge appeared on the incriminating flap? He asked no further questions, contenting himself with a polite assurance that the matter was being examined with full propriety. She seemed disappointed by his restraint, as though hoping for some pronouncement of guilt to enliven her conversation at tea. Later that day he encountered Councillor Hargreaves on the street, a man perpetually anxious that scandal might touch his drapery business. Hargreaves leaned in confidentially and declared that Miss Drabble's guilt was plain as day, then immediately added with nervous speed that he himself had never in his life purchased such material. Purbright, amused, wondered who had accused him. Hargreaves's eyes flickered whenever the word magazine was uttered, as though a guilty memory pricked him. It was behaviour of interest, but no more. By Monday, Sergeant Malley brought news that several townsfolk had decided to boycott Miss Drabble's shop. "Says a lot, sir," Malley remarked, when folk would rather walk half a mile for a stamp, than be seen buying one from her. Purbright replied mildly that boycotts usually said more about the townsfolk than about the target. He then asked Mally if he recalled the condition of the envelope flap when it was brought in. Mally frowned and admitted he hadn't looked closely, only that it was sealed. Sealed, yes, Purbright said, but by whose hand? That evening, Purbright again walked past the church. Choir practice was underway, and the boys' voices drifted out in pure, unaffected clarity. Colin's voice, light and sweet, rose above the rest, innocent of scandal. Purbright paused by the lich gate, reflecting that the lad had become an unwilling symbol for the town's need to displace its own indiscretions. He thought of the lipstick smudge, of Mrs. Tombs's careful mouth, and of Miss Drabble's stubborn silence. Each was trivial in itself. Yet trivialities, in Flaxborough, were often the hinges upon which entire scandals turned. He returned to the station with his mind quietly alert. He was not ready to accuse, not even to suspect openly, but he felt he had placed his finger upon the loose thread. And in Flaxborough, once a thread was pulled, the whole fabric usually began to come away. Inspector Purbright was not given to hurry, but the accumulation of whispers pressing upon Miss Drabble's door, and the faintly damning lipstick trace, suggested it was time to widen his inquiries. The matter could not remain a two-character play between a defensive shopkeeper and an overzealous alderman. Flaxborough possessed more performers in the theatre of hypocrisy, and Purbright knew each would eventually contribute their own revealing gesture. He began with a discreet visit to the Gazette offices. Mr. Mortlake, the editor, greeted him with his usual air of being perpetually affronted by the slowness of news in a town that specialized in it. When Purbright inquired as to the paper's decision to print so pointed a notice, Mortlake affected innocence. "We serve the public interest, Inspector. If that involves discouraging the perils of indecent literature, we must do so." His expression, however, betrayed relish rather than duty. Purbright asked whether the Gazette had ever received advertisements or subscription forms for periodicals like the Rapture Weekly. Mortlake shuffled uneasily and muttered something about his advertising clerk, Mr. Spankling, who might know more. Spankling, when consulted, was less discreet. "Oh, certainly, sir. We've had one or two inquiries of that nature. Nothing illegal, mind you, but hardly the sort of thing to shout from the rooftops. Confidentiality, you understand." His sly grin suggested that confidentiality was currency he rarely failed to spend. Purbright left with the impression that the Gazette had an excellent nose for scandal and an even better hand for stirring it. From there he turned to the vicar himself, Reverend Tombs. The man received him in the vestry, amidst faintly damp cassocks. Tombs was anxious, more so than Purbright expected. "Inspector, this has caused me no end of difficulty. Parishioners speak as if my church were a den of corruption. I assure you my wife and I strive ceaselessly to keep St. Swithin's a beacon of decency." Purbright asked gently if Mrs. Tombs had mentioned seeing the envelope. The vicar hesitated, then admitted, "She may have remarked on it. She is sensitive to appearances, you know." His glance toward the rectory window was nervous. As he left the church, Purbright encountered Mr. Chubb, the choirmaster, a fretful man whose devotion to order made him an efficient conductor of hymnody but a poor conductor of human gossip. "Terrible business, Inspector," he said, wringing his hands. "Terrible. I dare say the choir may be ruined. Parents are already threatening withdrawals. One has to ask, should a boy like Colin be allowed to continue? His voice is angelic, but one must consider the effect of scandal." Purbright replied that voices were rarely corrupted by envelopes. Chubb looked startled, then muttered about the importance of standards. Purbright took note. There was another man too eager to disassociate the boy from innocence. Fear often shouted louder than guilt, but both sounded remarkably similar. At dusk, he decided upon another tack. He visited the railway arms once more, where the evening trade had grown plump on conjecture. Over tankards, men recounted new variations of the story. One insisted Colin had confessed to receiving regular parcels from London. Another swore Miss Drabble had ordered 6 copies, not 1. Alderman Blunt, inevitably, presided like a conductor at a symphony of innuendo, declaring that unless firm measures were taken, Flaxborough would be the next Sodom. Purbright's quiet presence at a side table drew no attention. In their eagerness to speak, townsfolk rarely noticed the man who listened. But it was at the bar that Purbright found his trivial clue echoing faintly. Mrs. Ruddle, the barmaid, leaned across with a smile. "I expect you've heard all about the business, Inspector. Funny thing, though, I saw Mrs. Tombs in here last month buying a bottle of tonic wine. When she paid, she took a letter from her handbag, and I swear it had the same purple printing as that envelope everyone's talking about. I thought not of it at the time, but—" She shrugged, eyes bright with the thrill of sharing. The lipstick mark, the vicar's nervous glance, the barmaid's memory, each strand pulled the fabric a little looser. Still Purbright refrained from conclusions. It was not yet clear whether Mrs. Tombs had subscribed or merely handled something belonging to another. Yet her connection seemed increasingly difficult to dismiss. Back at the station, Purbright found Sergeant Malley waiting with fresh gossip. "Sir, word is going round that Councillor Hargreaves has been buying up back numbers of those story papers. A fellow at the railway kiosk says he's seen him." Purbright listened without expression. Hargreaves had indeed seemed nervous, but Malley's source was hardly more reliable than the town's grapevine. Before retiring for the night, Purbright allowed himself a small smile. The field was widening, as it always did, from one obvious suspect to a constellation of minor possibilities. In that constellation lay the truth, faint but steady. He thought again of the lipstick smudge, of the vicar's evasions, of the barmaid's recollection. The case, though trifling in its object, was beginning to expose the subtler machinery of Flaxborough respectability. And Purbright, with his customary patience, was content to let each wheel turn until the guilty cog revealed itself. It was on a drizzling Thursday morning, just as the scandal seemed to have settled into the comfortable rut of repetition, that another disturbance arose to refresh the town's appetite. Mrs. Cam, who rarely failed to detect impropriety within 50 yards of her doorstep, came rushing into the police station with a parcel she claimed to have, discovered behind the hedge bordering the churchyard. The paper wrapping was rain-stained but intact, and within it lay 3 issues of The Rapture Weekly, their covers adorned with melodramatic sketches of swooning heroines and men with improbable jawlines. Sergeant Malley received the bundle as though it might explode. "Well, that settles it, sir," he declared to Purbright. "The magazines themselves, found on church property. Can't get clearer." Purbright regarded the damp papers without comment, then slowly turned one over in his hands. On the back, an address label clung stubbornly to the sodden paper. The name, blurred but legible, was not Miss Drabble's. It was Mrs. Tombs, the rectory. The revelation, though quiet, struck like a suppressed thunderclap. Malley's eyes widened with delight. "So it's her, the vicar's lady!" I said there was something odd about how she carried on. Purbright, however, responded with his usual restraint. "Let us not gallop. A label is evidence of posting, not of readership. Still it is instructive. Within hours, the town knew. Mrs. Cam had not kept her discovery to herself, and by the time the parcel reached Purbright's desk, the postmistress had already conveyed news of its addressee to half the high street. Gossip turned eagerly from Miss Drabble to Mrs. Tombs, a transition accomplished with such enthusiasm, one might imagine, The whole affair had been staged purely for entertainment. In the Railway Arms that evening, the men spoke with relish of the person's missus and her stories, while the women in the grocer's speculated with disapproving relish about her need for romance. For Reverend Toombs the blow was heavy. He presented himself at the station in a state of agitation. "Inspector, you must believe me, my wife has no interest in such things. This is some vile trick. Enemies of the church, perhaps Alderman Blunt, with his eternal scheming." Purbright calmed him with patient words, promising only to look into the matter thoroughly. Yet, inwardly, he marked the vicar's panic, less that of a husband defending his wife's virtue, more of a man aware how fragile his authority was before the court of parish opinion. Purbright next visited the rectory. Mrs. Toombs greeted him with composed dignity, though her fingers tightened on the arm of the chair when he produced the sodden magazines. "These, madam, were found near the churchyard. They bear your name and address." For a moment her poise faltered. "Someone has played a cruel trick," she said swiftly. "Alderman Blunt, no doubt. He detests my husband's sermons." She denied ever sending away for the periodical, though she admitted she had once seen an advertisement. Her insistence was firm, but her eyes betrayed a flicker when Purbright mentioned the envelope and its lipstick-stained flap. He said nothing further, merely rising with a polite bow. Her thanks when she offered it was edged with relief that he had not pressed harder. As he walked back, Purbright considered the curious convenience of the discovery. A parcel so neatly labelled, so perfectly incriminating, yet abandoned in a hedge where it would surely be found by precisely the sort of woman who delighted in finding it. Too neat again, he thought. Scandals in Flaxborough never lacked volunteers to add embroidery, but this embroidery looked deliberate. That evening, when the choir boys emerged from practice into the mist, Colin lingered by the gate. Seeing Purbright, he shuffled his feet and looked up nervously. "Sir," he said, "I think Aunt's in trouble she didn't make. She said she promised to help someone. She wouldn't say who, but she was afraid." Purbright laid a hand gently on the boy's shoulder and told him not to worry. Sometimes truth was simply slower than gossip, but it always arrived in the end. Later, in his office, he spread the envelope and the sodden magazines side by side. One bore the lipstick smudge, the other the unmistakable address of the vicar's wife. Between them stretched a line of suspicion that might be too easy, too obvious, too useful to those who thrived on scandal. He knew Flaxborough well enough to suspect that the real story lay not in who subscribed, but in who most desired that the town believe it. And so the field widened again, from Miss Drabble to Mrs. Toombs, from choir boys to councillors, from whispers to planted evidence. Purbright, leaning back with eyes half closed, allowed himself the faintest of smiles. The second incident had done what second incidents always did, turned certainty into doubt and doubt into something far more promising. Purbright was accustomed to cases that gathered bulk from repetition rather than fact, and the present affair had grown in precisely that way. Yet now, with Mrs. Toombs's name attached to a parcel of magazines and a lipstick smudge echoing the one he had already noticed, he found himself confronted with two possibilities. Either the truth was, after all, embarrassingly plain, or someone was industriously constructing an illusion for the town to devour. He leaned instinctively towards the latter. Flaxborough was not without its sinners, but its greater talent lay in manufacturing morality plays. That evening, seated in his office with the rain tapping gently against the window panes, Purbright allowed his thoughts to spread like ripples from the centre of the envelope and magazines. What was it that so animated the town's appetite for scandal? A lonely shopkeeper made a convenient villain, but now that she had been displaced by the vicar's wife, the drama had reached a more satisfying pitch. There was something deeply human, he reflected, in the pleasure people derived from seeing pillars of respectability shake upon their pedestals. A subscription to lurid romances was hardly a crime, yet in Flaxborough it had become a mirror into which every inhabitant projected their own nervous reflections. He considered Mrs. Tombs in particular. Her composure had been practiced, her denial unconvincing not because it was false, but because it was too precise, as though rehearsed. A guilty woman might fluster, but a frightened woman prepared her lines. Frightened of discovery, yes, but discovery of what? Her husband's authority was brittle, her own reputation brittle still. It was not impossible she sought small escapes in glossy romances. Yet Purbright had seen the magazines and the lipstick smudge and the fortuitous hedge discovery. Too theatrical. Someone was feeding the town a performance, and Mrs. Tombs was playing the assigned role whether she chose to or not. The inspector's mind drifted back to Alderman Blunt. Blunt had been conspicuous from the start, snatching up the choirboy's envelope, marching it officially to the station, preaching loudly of moral decay. The man was not a prude by nature. He relished innuendo far too much, but he understood power, and in Flaxborough power often rested upon the ability to shape the narrative of scandal. If Miss Drabble was disgraced, her little shop might dwindle. If Mrs. Tombs was tainted, the vicarage influence would falter. Both outcomes presented opportunities for a man with Blunt's taste for control. Purbright, however, also kept in mind that scandal rarely grew from nothing. There had to be a seed. Someone had subscribed, someone had handled the envelope, someone had chosen secrecy over honesty. A seed easily planted, but real nonetheless. The inspector rubbed his temples, thinking how delicate the distinction was between culpability and manipulation. His duty was not to protect the reputations of the guilty, but to identify who had engineered the stage play and for what purpose. He rose and wandered slowly through the station's corridors, nodding absently to Mally, who was compiling yet another list of townsfolk, certain of Miss Drabble's guilt yesterday, and equally certain of Mrs. Tombs's guilt today. Purbright returned to his desk and let his gaze rest on the sodden magazines. Their pages curled from damp, but the purple print on the address label remained stark. Too stark. He thought again of Mrs. Ruddle the barmaid's recollection, Mrs. Tombs taking a letter with purple print from her handbag. That single image troubled him. Was it a memory of a subscription form, a parcel, or something handed to her by another? He leaned back, folding his hands. Flaxborough was a place where people spoke more freely than they meant, where slips of tone mattered more than slips of paper. The key to the puzzle, he felt, was not in forensic analysis, but in listening. Miss Drabble had said she acted on behalf of a friend. Mrs. Tombs had insisted she was the victim of a trick. Alderman Blunt had thundered about corruption with unusual fervour. Hargreaves, nervous, had rushed to deny what no one had accused. Each spoke too much, too eagerly, as though words themselves betrayed them. Purbright smiled faintly at the irony. His profession was less about catching criminals than catching performances in the act of betraying themselves. Human beings, in their effort to appear respectable, often disclosed more through their manner of concealment than through their misdeeds. He recalled Mrs. Tombs's careful dignity, the trembling of her fingers, Miss Drabble's stiff refusal, edged with genuine loyalty, Blunt's zeal, sharpened not by virtue but by ambition. He saw in each of them not crime, but fear of ridicule, fear of loss, fear of being thought less than their neighbours. For now, Purbright resolved to wait. He would continue his polite questions, his unhurried visits, his quiet observations in the railway arms. The gossip would swell and subside as it always did, but within its eddies the truth would surface. Someone in Flaxborough had subscribed to the Rapture Weekly. But more importantly, someone else had ensured the subscription became a spectacle. The inspector knew which of those two acts was the greater offence in a town like this. And so, as the rain fell and the gas lamps flickered in the street, Inspector Purbright folded his hands upon his desk and let his thoughts settle. The case was not yet ripe, but it was ripening. The time would come for a single remark, a well-placed question that would shift the weight of guilt onto the shoulders of the one who could not bear it. Until then, patience. It was the inspector's greatest ally and Flaxborough's most alien quality. Purbright decided that the time had come to set a small stone rolling and see which hill it disturbed. Waiting too long allowed gossip to harden into fact, and fact in Flaxborough, once hardened, could not be shifted without the chisel of scandal's replacement. He required, as always, only a gentle nudge, one remark, one carefully chosen circumstance to reveal which of the town's performers would falter when the audience's gaze was sharpened. He began at the Railway Arms, where he knew his words would not remain confined to those who heard them. One evening, as Alderman Blunt held forth on the degeneracy of modern youth, Purbright wandered deliberately within earshot and remarked, in tones of idle curiosity, "Odd thing, Alderman, whoever sealed that envelope must have been in a hurry, lipstick across the flap, quite unmistakable." He said no more, ordered his pint, and withdrew to a quiet table. But the effect was immediate. Blunt's eyes flickered with something more than surprise, calculation. He recovered quickly and continued his sermon, but his voice was fractionally less assured. By the following day the town had absorbed the inspector's hint. Conversations in shops included new speculation about the lipstick. Some thought it proof of Mrs. Tombs's guilt, others that Miss Drabble had been vain enough after all. But Purbright, attentive as always, noticed that one man grew notably uneasy, Councillor Hargreaves. The draper, who only days before had insisted with nervous eagerness on his innocence, now busied himself with denials no one had demanded. He was overheard saying at least twice in the market square that he had no use for lipsticks in his household. The remark, meant as reassurance, betrayed the anxious mind beneath. Purbright followed this thread with polite persistence. He called at the drapery shop under the pretext of purchasing handkerchiefs. Hargreaves greeted him with stiff cordiality, but his hands trembled slightly as he unfolded a neat stack of linen. Purbright spoke of trifles, then casually observed curious business with that envelope. Whoever handled it left a woman's mark. One wonders whose. Hargreaves's smile froze. "Not mine, Inspector, nor anyone in my house." The answer was too swift, too rehearsed, as if already prepared for precisely that suggestion. Purbright thanked him with bland cheerfulness and departed, leaving the councillor pale against the bolts of fabric. That evening he set the second part of his test. He requested Miss Drabble come to the station, ostensibly to discuss the harassment she was enduring. She arrived stiff and defensive, but softened slightly when Purbright asked after Colin. After a pause, he said with quiet sympathy, "You were asked to protect a friend's secret. Perhaps you still mean to, but if that secret is now being twisted by others, it may be less a kindness than a cruelty." Her lips tightened, yet her eyes moistened. She murmured only, "I promised," and left without further explanation. That promise was telling. Loyalty rarely attached itself to abstractions. It attached to people. Whoever had truly arranged the subscription was not Miss Drabble herself, but someone she cared for, or feared for, deeply enough to endure disgrace. Purbright's test was completed the next afternoon at a parish committee meeting. He attended under the pretext of consulting with the vicar about traffic congestion near the church gates. The committee included Blunt, Hargreaves, and Mrs. Tombs. each of whom bore the marks of recent gossip. During the meeting's polite wrangling over road signs, Purbright interjected, almost absent-mindedly, "There is something about handwriting that fascinates me. That subscription form, for instance. Quite distinctive loops in the capital letters. One day I must compare it properly." He offered the remark with a genial smile, as though making conversation. The effect was quiet, but decisive. Mrs. Tombs's lips pressed together until colour drained from them. Blunt dropped his papers with a clatter, but it was Hargreaves who betrayed himself most. He shifted abruptly in his chair, coughed, and began a rambling digression about postal services, his voice rising with forced cheerfulness. The others looked at him curiously. Purbright said nothing more. He had no intention of confronting them then and there. He had only wished to observe, and he had observed enough. The guilty party was not yet named, but the guilty conscience had flinched. Now it was only a matter of waiting until that flinch became a stumble, until a further push revealed the full picture. As he left the rectory hall into the damp evening, Purbright felt the satisfaction of a man whose trap required no ropes or locks, only patience. The town would continue to chatter, the gossip would surge and recede, but the seed of unease he had planted was growing steadily. Someone among them now felt the walls closing in, and in Flaxborough such pressure invariably forced confession, whether spoken or betrayed in action. The inspector drew his coat tighter and walked back towards the station. He knew that soon, very soon, the play would reach its final act. The effect of Purbright's casual remark about handwriting lingered in Flaxborough like smoke after a damp bonfire. By the next day, the parish committee's awkward silences had already been translated into half a dozen competing stories. Some said the inspector had compared Mrs. Tombs's shopping lists to the subscription form and found them identical. Others swore that Alderman Blunt had been caught red-handed in a forgery. Yet others insisted Councillor Hargreaves was on the verge of resignation. The truth, as Purbright knew, was none of these, but truth had very little bearing on the town's entertainment. The inspector himself passed the day in apparent idleness. He walked the high street, stopping to observe the nervous exchanges between townsfolk. At the drapery, Hargreaves was tight-lipped with customers. At the rectory, curtains remained firmly drawn. Miss Drabble continued to run her shop with an iron spine, though business had dwindled. Alderman Blunt, meanwhile, strode about with exaggerated confidence, loudly predicting that a shocking exposure was imminent. Purbright, noting these performances, understood they were as good as fingerprints. Guilt could be feigned, but fear could not. In the station that afternoon, Sergeant Malley delivered his own conclusions with relish. "It's the vicar's wife, sir. Has to be. Those magazines addressed to her, lipstick on the envelope, too much to ignore." Purbright only smiled mildly. "Indeed, Malley. Yet curiously, guilt often presents itself too conveniently. I sometimes wonder if truth would ever bother with convenience." Malley, puzzled, returned to his paperwork, muttering something about women and their tricks. As evening drew in, Purbright arranged a small gathering under the guise of a routine consultation. He requested Mrs. Tombs, Miss Drabble, Councillor Hargreaves, and Alderman Blunt attend him in the vestry after choir practice. Each came with reluctance, though for different reasons. Mrs. Tombs pale and dignified, Miss Drabble bristling with indignation, Hargreaves perspiring at the temples, Blunt expansive with self-importance. Purbright received them with a politeness that concealed his deliberate purpose. He spoke first of the town's unrest, the harm done to reputations, the cruelty inflicted on young Colin by rumour. Each listened with the strained expressions of actors awaiting their cue. Then in the same mild voice he mentioned the magazines discovered in the hedge. He laid one upon the table, addressed to Mrs. Tombs, too obvious, some might think, almost as if placed for discovery. He turned his gaze towards Blunt, whose broad smile stiffened. Next, he produced the envelope. And here the form is sealed with lipstick. Curious, isn't it? Miss Drabble is no user of such paint by her own account. Yet Mrs. Tombs, as we know, favours a particular shade. An unfortunate coincidence or a deliberate imitation? He let the words hang. Mrs. Tombs lifted her chin. "Inspector, I have said before, I never sent away for such things." Her voice was steady, but her hands gripped her prayer book too tightly. Purbright inclined his head gently, then turned to Hargreaves. "And you, counsellor? When last we spoke, you assured me no lipstick could be found in your household. Curious that you felt compelled to insist upon it when no one had suggested otherwise." Hargreaves's mouth opened and shut. His denial came too quickly, too clumsily. Blunt gave a chuckle that died in his throat when Purbright added, "And you, Alderman, seem remarkably eager for verdicts. One wonders whether you prefer justice, or only a spectacle that suits your ambitions." He rose, pacing slowly. "The truth, I think, lies not in lurid magazines, but in the fear of ridicule. Someone in this town subscribed for reasons entirely human. Loneliness, boredom, perhaps mere curiosity. Yet another seized the chance to magnify the matter, to shape it into scandal, to damage rivals. That, to my mind, is the true impropriety." The silence that followed was thick with unease. Blunt shifted. Mrs. Tombs flushed. Hargreaves fumbled with his handkerchief. Miss Drabble stared at the floor. Purbright allowed the silence to deepen, his eyes moving from one to the other. Then he said quietly, "I will explain fully soon enough. For now, I suggest we each consider how little a secret is worth in Flaxborough once it becomes the town's entertainment." He dismissed them with courteous bows, leaving them unsettled and restless. As they departed, Purbright observed the smallest gestures, Blunt striding too fast, eager to escape scrutiny, Hargreaves mopping his brow, muttering excuses, Mrs. Tombs pausing at the door as though to steady herself, Miss Drabble alone left in silence, but her eyes glimmered with the conflict of loyalty and fatigue. When the vestry was empty, Purbright returned the magazines to their wrapping and sat a while in the quiet. He had no need for dramatic accusations yet. The threads were almost drawn together, the guilty conscience already strained. One more turn, one more question, and the truth would come into the open of its own accord. The town would have its reveal soon enough, and so the inspector remained, still, listening to the last notes of choir boys drifting through the church, letting their unbroken harmony remind him of the irony. Innocence, clear and ringing, set against the tangled chorus of adult duplicity. He smiled faintly. The final act was nearly ready. The following evening, Purbright invited a smaller circle to the station. He had dispensed with the formality of a public summons, choosing instead the intimacy of a quiet office with its familiar smell of lamp oil and damp coats. Miss Drabble, pale but determined, sat stiffly by the window. Mrs. Tombs occupied the chair nearest the fire, her dignity intact but fraying at the edges. Councillor Hargreaves perched on the edge of his seat, visibly perspiring. Alderman Blunt leaned expansively against the mantelpiece, clearly anticipating a triumphant moment when the inspector would vindicate his crusade. Purbright began in his customary mild tone, as though discussing the misplacement of a library book. "Ladies, gentlemen, we are gathered not to pronounce guilt in any criminal sense. No laws have been broken. What is at stake is reputation, which in Flaxborough, as you know, often weighs heavier than law." His eyes moved from one face to the next. The envelope, the magazines, the accusations, each of these has been arranged in such a way as to suggest certainty. Yet certainty in this town is nearly always a trap. Blunt gave a harumph of impatience, but Purbright ignored him. He laid the damp magazines on the desk. These were found with Mrs. Tombs's name upon them. Too obvious, too clumsily abandoned to be anything but deliberate. Someone wanted them discovered, and by the right eyes. Mrs. Cam was very obliging. He looked at Mrs. Tombs. "Madam, your protestations ring true in this sense. You did not post the subscription. You were made to appear as though you had." A faint sigh of relief escaped her lips, though she remained silent. Purbright turned to Miss Drabble. "You, madam, told me you acted on behalf of a friend. That friend's identity you have guarded faithfully, even at cost to yourself. I do not ask you to betray your confidence. I will spare you the burden. For the handwriting on the subscription form, compared against a sample most obligingly provided during our parish meeting, bears the unmistakable loops and flourishes of Councillor Hargreaves." All eyes turned. Hargreaves, blotched and trembling, dropped his handkerchief. "This is nonsense," he stammered. "I wonder why I have never raised a calming hand. Councillor, curiosity is no sin, loneliness is no crime, but deception and worse, cowardice do have consequences. You asked Miss Drabble to post the form, too fearful to let it be traced to your own household. She, loyal or perhaps pitying, agreed. The envelope was sealed hastily by your hand, not hers, and bore the careless trace of lipstick borrowed in a foolish attempt to disguise. When the town's gossip threatened to corner you, you whispered to Alderman Blunt, who saw in the business an opportunity to parade himself as guardian of morals. Together, you let suspicion fall where it would most easily stick on Miss Drabble, then on Mrs. Tombs. Hargreaves's mouth opened, then closed. His shoulders slumped. Blunt reddened furiously. "Inspector, you cannot! This is outrageous!" Purbright turned his gaze upon him. "Outrageous, Alderman, is your eagerness to wield scandal as a weapon. You did not subscribe, but you cultivated the storm with deliberate relish and ensured evidence surfaced where it would wound most deeply." A hedge, a label, a whisper to Mrs. Cam, each stage prepared like a dramatist arranging acts. You sought to diminish rivals and polish your own virtue by spectacle. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint hiss of the fire. Mrs. Tombs, her composure returned, sat straighter. Miss Drabble's lips trembled with relief, though she said nothing. Hargreaves, sweat shining on his forehead, whispered, "It was harmless. Only stories. I never meant." His voice trailed into despair. Purbright spoke more gently now. "Councillor, you might have been left to your little secret. Many are. But once gossip took hold, you and the alderman chose deception over dignity, letting others suffer to shield yourselves. That is what has offended decency more than any periodical could." Blunt muttered threats of legal redress, but the sound was hollow. He knew the inspector had stripped him of his performance. Mrs. Tombs rose, gathering her shawl. "I thank you, Inspector. The truth may not still be the tongues of Flaxborough, but it steadies mine." She departed with head high. Miss Drabble followed silently, pausing only to murmur to Purbright, "I did promise, and I kept it." He inclined his head. Left alone with Blunt and Hargreaves, Purbright delivered his final words without rancour. "You will not face charges, but I assure you, gentlemen, Flaxborough will punish you in its own way. The town's memory for the scandal is short but merciless. One cannot govern or sell drapery or preach morality with a laugh always waiting at the corner." He dismissed them, and when the office was empty, he returned the envelope and magazines to a drawer, their usefulness concluded. Then he sat, pen in hand, drafting the day's report with the quiet thoroughness of a man who had long since grown accustomed to tidying away other people's chaos. Outside, the choir boys' voices drifted once more through the damp night, clear and unsullied. Purbright permitted himself a smile at the irony. Innocence had remained where no one thought to look, while respectability had been soiled by its own anxious posturing. When the final line of his report was written, he replaced his pen, straightened his papers, and prepared to resume the ordinary rhythm of station life. Another scandal had flared, another had been extinguished, and Flaxborough, in its peculiar way, would return to normality, bruised, but secretly content with the entertainment. Purbright, as ever, would keep his watch with patience, for there would always be another oddity waiting just beneath the polished surface of the town.